So I guess there's actually multiple international policy frameworks that relate to climate change education, because climate change education can be many things. It's also justice education, it's also biodiversity education, it's of course environmental education. So we don't need to, when we're thinking about the policy frameworks that align with climate change education, we don't need to limit ourselves explicitly to those policies that are badged, or we don't need to limit ourselves to the policies that are explicitly badged as climate change education. But there's a few that spring to mind that are really prominent. I guess there's the Sustainable Development Goals, which most people will have heard of, which was set in 2015, and then they expire in 2030, so their deadline's coming up soon. The overall goal there is for, they're described in terms of people, planet, prosperity, peace and partnership. But in terms of education, we can kind of narrow in onto goal 4, which is quality education, which is to ensure inclusive and equitable quality education and promote lifelong learning opportunities for all. And that contains target 4.7, which is the target that specifically relates to sustainability education, I guess. It also aligns with another goal, goal 13, climate action, which the purpose of which is to take urgent action to combat climate change and its impacts. And there's a couple of targets there where you might want to position your work relative to goal 13. A second framework, I think sometimes that certainly gets overlooked in some of the circles that I've worked in, is the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. And this includes several articles that could overlap or be used to frame or advocate or to develop strategies which support climate change related education. So for instance, Article 29 states that children's education should help them to fully develop their personalities, talents and abilities. It should teach them to understand their own rights and respect other people's rights, cultures and differences. It should help them to live peacefully and protect the environment. And there's clear parallels there, or overlaps or links with climate education in there. A third one, a third policy framework that's worth considering is the Convention on Biological Diversity. And this includes an article which is to enhance communication, education and awareness on biodiversity. And so if you're approaching climate change education from a biodiversity perspective, that can be a policy hook, I guess, to talk to there. And the fourth one, which is the one that I've worked with the most, and that most explicitly links to climate change education, is the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And now that's the global agreement that focuses on climate change. And that includes, in terms of education, it includes action for climate empowerment. That's a work stream of the UNFCCC, which includes education alongside training, public awareness, public participation, public access to information and international cooperation. So it's quite a broad framework which describes, which creates space and kind of the policy glue, if you like, to link up a whole lot of different activities and strategies for helping communities and society to act on climate change. So I'll probably focus on ESE and the UNFCCC here to think about the linkages between environmental education and these frameworks. And I'll probably talk more about environmental education. That's probably the space I'm more comfortable with. So ultimately, the UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, of which Action for Climate Empowerment is a part, it's the international agreement to drive action that will prevent us reaching, planetary boundaries because of climate change. So it's a super important internationally binding agreement. And even if there is scope to question its efficacy, it is the best policy lever that we have. So for thinking about environmental education and thinking about climate change education, as sort of perhaps we can position that within environmental education, the UNFCCC and ESE, the goals of it are unambiguously linked to environmental education. In terms of the content, so thinking about the content of environmental education, it might not be solely focused on climate change, but it could include a focus on climate change causes and impacts, on mitigation and adaptation strategies. Environmental education could include content on fostering sustainable ways of living or tackling unsustainable ways of living. It could include content on fostering and enacting care for all species on Earth, be that conservation, restoration and regeneration. And I think the UNFCCC as a policy framework has scope to link environmental education with all of those sort of content domains. I think what's important to note about what it doesn't do, it's that the UNFCCC or ESE doesn't tell environmental education practitioners what to do, and it doesn't tell policymakers what to do. And that's partly because the environmental education that will be effective and that's needed and that can be resourced will be different in different countries, in different regions of a country, between communities, between schools, between classrooms. So that could never be agreed by consensus. However, ESE can provide the policy home for all sorts of environmental education activity, which can include formal, informal, non-formal approaches. It can encompass training or have public awareness and information sharing objectives. So it provides scope for environmental education, which occurs across all sectors of society and across all age groups. And so I think ESE is a really helpful lever, I guess, to present the case that education is part of a spectrum of approaches that together empower action, that it's not for education and formal education in particular to fix it or provide the salvation, but that investment is needed across and effort is needed across all of these different dimensions. I think these frameworks are really helpful for researchers who are working in climate change education or environmental education for several reasons. I think they're really helpful for thinking about the kind of policy impact that we might want to make through our work, and thinking about how ESE is positioned in your national context. So how might you want to be supporting your country's or your nation's efforts to meet their obligations under the ESE action plan. So that's number one. I think in terms of they're really helpful in terms of advocacy. Many countries want to be world leading with their climate change education approaches. ESE is a prominent international framework. And so if your work is aligned to sort of supporting your nation to be world leading, I think that can be a really worthwhile endeavour for your research. I think these frameworks are also really important in terms of accountability. So as researchers and as committed practitioners in the field of environmental education, I guess we want our countries to be meeting their obligations under the Paris Agreement. And so we have a responsibility, I guess, to be holding our governments to account for delivering on those. And our countries have signed up to these agreements. So they're a really important tool for researchers to support, I guess, to work with their governments to make sure that our governments are delivering on their commitments under the Paris Agreement. I also think these policy frameworks are really revealing of norms or of discourses in the field of environmental education and climate change education. So I think sometimes we can get in our bubble, our academic bubbles or our research bubbles about how we think about climate change or environmental education and how we talk about it. But these policies, particularly these internationally agreed ones, that are agreed by consensus, can give us a real benchmark of the norms in the field, or tell us something about the status quo, I guess. thinking around climate change and environmental education. And so they can give us some insight into where our advocacy is landing and where the ideas from our research are succeeding, or where they're not actually getting cut through into policy environments. I think they can also be they can also be really powerful levers for funding, depending on the context in which you work. Some organisations, some funders will be more keen than others to make sure that their work is aligning to the Paris Agreement, for instance, is helping to deliver on the goals of the Paris Agreement. So connecting your work to ESE can be a powerful, it can help to build your case. And finally, I think they can really reveal or help to generate thinking about how education, whichever form of education you work with, but in the case of formal education, how that can actually align with other areas of work that are seeking to empower communities, citizens to act on climate change. So as I've said before, like ESE can be thought of as policy glue. It can also be thought of as practice glue, I guess, or research glue, in that it can help us to think about how, okay, so how does our work in education actually align with and become more impactful if it's aligned with activities that are being undertaken in public awareness or in international cooperation or in training. So I think they have a lot of affordances for researchers. They're not necessarily instructive, but I think they can be incredibly generative, and I think they're incredibly important. Thank you, Stefan.